welcome. Thank you very, very much for joining us for our interview with Dr. Diane Larsen-Freeman, who will be introducing to everybody in a second. And first of all, I'd just like to say thank you very much to International House Montevideo for lending us their Zoom room and for sponsoring us. And we understand that we know that there was a very successful first ever online conference for International House Montevideo to help teachers in Uruguay, South America, and around the world. So thank you very much indeed to International House Montevideo. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing the presentation now. Fantastic. I'll go into speaker view in 1 second. But first of all, just to say welcome to Dr. Diane Larsen-Freeman. Thank you very, very much for joining us. It's a great honor to have you here with us today, and it's thanks in no small part to a mutual friend of ours, Professor Sarah Mercer. So Sarah, if you're out there somewhere who can hear us, thank you. Yes, exactly. Thank you very much indeed. So Dr. Diane Larsen-Freeman probably doesn't need a huge amount of introduction, but just to say that apart from the seminal text that we have, probably everyone in this room has read about techniques and principles in language teaching and also on complexity theory, we'll also be talking a little bit about that and about learner agency as well. So, once I've relaxed a bit and stopped being so nervous, I will say hello to Diane. I'm going to put you on speaker view now.
Welcome, Diane.
Yes, welcome, Diane. Thank you very much for joining us again.
Thank you, Alastair. Thank you, Florencia. And thank you all for being with me this afternoon, evening, nighttime, reading.
Where are you exactly at the moment?
Where am I? I'm in my office. And I told Alastair and Florencia before we began that I wasn't going to remove this tattered paper. You may be able to see a corner of it here behind me, because it is a drawing by one of my grandchildren. And so I surround myself in my office with that. I should maybe show it to you, or maybe I shouldn't.
Please, yes.
But you know, I mean, what's so interesting about it is interesting to me, besides the, you can't really see it, is that all the trees are cones, all the, all the trees are lollipops, all the mountains are cones, right? And why is that? That seems to be a universal. Why do we all start out drawing trees like lollipops? So that's another, actually, that's another whole lecture.
That could be a whole other interview, couldn't it?
It is. And I'm very interested in that kind of idea of why we, you know, we reduce the geometry to the outlines, sort of. And anyway, even those of us who, you know, grow up with non-deciduous trees draw them that way. But again, that's
true.
You'll just have to ask Sarah to ask me again.
Well, apart from being in your office, what we wanted to start by asking is where you are in the world.
Yes, sorry, that was a little.
No, ambiguous. I know you were joking.
No, I wasn't joking. I am in my office.
Okay, no.
Vermont is a state, a small state in the northeast of the United States, part of New England. And what do you want to know about that? Beyond that, it is very small. It's very rural. The whole state has only 500,000 people. You may know it because our senator, we have, of course, 2 senators, as all states in the United States do. One of them is Senator Bernie Sanders, who is famous or notorious, depending on your political
position, yes,
as the only independent democratic socialist in Congress. So that gives you a little sense of the politics of the area, at least for many people.
It does, absolutely. Well, that's very interesting, because actually I want to come on to another politician that you mentioned in one of your papers a bit later on in the interview. But where you are in Vermont, how do you feel, just for a second, how the pandemic for you is being handled locally?
Yeah. Well, despite the fact that Bernie Sanders is our senator, we have a Republican governor, and so he's much more conservative politically, but he's being credited with doing a good job. We We shut down early in the pandemic. We did the ternary, keep your hands or wash your hands, keep physically distant. I don't like socially distant, but physically distant, and wear masks. And the local town, Brattleboro, actually has had a long time a mandate for wearing masks downtown. So that's effectively not eliminated, of course, but curbed the damage that has been done. We've still lost 58 people, and there are 58 families in mourning, but relatively unscathed compared to a lot of the other parts of this country, which have shamefully lost many, many more people. Not to say we haven't been affected, of course. School stopped mid-March. Teaching and learning went online. My granddaughter, who I just introduced you to briefly, had her kindergarten year interrupted. She was very unhappy about that. She loved her. The teachers had to scramble and be resilient, as teachers are, to do online learning. And here, because we are rural, believe it or not, we are in the United States, but because we are rural, we have broadband access problems. Not all the schools in this, or homes in this state are connected with broadband access to the internet. So that's disrupted education.
Yes.
And then there are lots of people out of work. We have a shameful problem in this country too, of people who have been displaced or homeless. We did have one bright star, a local innovator introduced the idea of everyone eats, and through a grant from the state has established a program that is now going to be scaled up at the state level that connects farms with restaurants, with people who are food insecure. So the restaurants pledge to use a certain portion, at least 10% of local farm produce, to create meals, which in turn they're reimbursed for and are offered to people who are needy, who need the food. And so it works reasonably well. One of our dairies has just gone out of business. They just couldn't be sustained during this time. And of course, we're a big tourist state. So our big tourism industry, no, not industry, but tourism, next in a month or so is going to be the beautiful leaves of the autumn. And I don't know what kind of traffic we're going to get. Usually people come from all over the world to see it. Big ski season, who knows? A lot of jobs depend on that. So I think 1 second, and I've gone on for a bit, but I feel, grateful on the one hand, but we've also seen that populations have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and that's something we need to attend to. There's still a lot of people living in poverty, and that also requires attention. So myself, I feel very fortunate. I have a home. I can get out and walk outside. And I hope for the best around the world. We're all in this together, as you say.
Wonderful. Yes, I mean, poverty is certainly a problem where we are based here in Argentina as well. But I can see in the chat box there are many people writing not only from Argentina, but we've seen Uruguay, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Egypt, Georgia. So plenty of places in the world. And from Armenia, someone's just written Mexico, Oman. Well, I'll stop reeling off the list of country names, but you get the idea. So yes, everyone's being affected in different ways, I suppose. So here in Argentina, Diane, one of the reasons you are so famous is because of your book, Techniques and Principles in Language Teaching. And in fact, it's the university I work at, UTN, it's a set text, and I think it is on most English language teaching degrees here and in some other countries as well. Do you feel that today, where are we, 20th of September 2020, that methods are still as relevant today as they are in the past, or are we like post methods now? What would you say?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I understand the post methods movement. Now, certainly postmodernism, has invited us to challenge grand narratives. However, I think that something's lost if we think of ourselves as being beyond methods. A lot of things are lost if we think of being beyond methods. Of course, no one wants to impose a method. No one wants to do that. And even if you do, I trust that teachers will adjust and adapt locally so they don't look the same classroom to classroom. But beyond that, methods are great examples of what I've called thought in action, coherent thought and action links, right? Techniques and principles. There are wonderful models, first of all, for neophyte teachers, novice teachers who are just beginning to have something to understand the history of the field and to understand the options that some people have come up with. But even for more experienced teachers, methods can offer a broader repertoire of techniques and can invite teachers to construct their own methods, if you want to use that word, construct their own set of principles and techniques they derive or associate from those. So I think it's unfortunate that we say we're beyond methods. Methods can be very, very helpful, provided that they're not imported or exported in lockstep fashion. So yeah, I think there's still a place for them, certainly in teacher education. But as I say, even with veteran teachers, I myself have created my own method by becoming aware of the different way people think about language and its learning and its teaching, and drawing from a number of different methods, principles that make sense to me and that inform my practice.
So I really like what you've just said. The idea of, well, like you just said, you've invented your own method because, as I understand it from what you said, like the way you teach, you know, you've learned a lot from X amount of other methods, approaches, and presumably from observing other teachers. So in a way, teachers kind of invent their own methods. The way they teach is their own method, as it were.
I think that's right. I mean, they might take one existing method and adapt it, but you know, I learned a long time ago that I could go into two different classrooms. In both classrooms, the teachers said they were practicing communicative language teaching or a communicative approach, and they looked very, very different. So even starting from the same place, you wind up naturally. It's not that they misinterpreted it, is that teachers naturally, I think, adapt to the locality as they should, into their own sense of how things should be. And their own sense of how things should be is often informed by their own experience. So that's another benefit in coming in contact with other methods, because they can challenge, they can challenge the positionality of us and ask us to consider other ways of being, other ways of doing. And yes, to construct our own ways in a way that makes sense and in a way that we can faithfully implement in the classroom.
Yes. Well, apart from techniques and principles, I wanted to ask you about your work on complex dynamic. I knew I was going to trip over my tongue. Complex dynamic systems. On complex dynamic systems theory. My biggest complexity with that apparently is pronouncing it, apart from anything else.
It's like CDST.
Yeah, quite. Could you tell us a little bit about complex dynamic systems theory?
A little bit?
Well.
Okay, let me, again, thank you for the question. Let me see if I can maybe tell you why I came to it. How's that? And then I will tell you a little bit about it, but I want to put it a little bit in context. Of course, this is autobiographical, as all our stories are. I've been involved in second language acquisition research for some time. I had the good fortune of being present when it was all sort of coming together in the modern age anyway. And I watched factors that were to be considered in second language acquisition grow from before that John Schumann cited in 1976, what to talk about, psychological distance, social distance, motivation, and aptitude, grow to 74 in Bernard Spolsky's book in 1989, 76 to 89. And goodness knows, there must be many, many, many more than the 76 that Bernard Spolsky pointed to. And yet, I kept saying to myself, are we really getting any closer to understanding second language acquisition? So that was one factor, the reductionism, the going for the smallest parts, and yet not being very satisfied that we had a holistic, a whole view. It's okay to go down, but how about going up too? The second discontent, a thing that I was discontented with, was the attempts, and I'm going to get a lot of people unhappy here, but the attempts to try to identify a single factor in an experiment, in a controlled experiment, where everything is controlled except that factor, and then look for a statistical significance between that factor as an intervention might highlight it. Look for whether it's statistically significant or not. And those kinds of studies I find interesting. They raise interesting questions. We can learn from them as well. But often the result of that is that we'd get to an end of the study and it would say, well, what we need is more research. And of course we do, and we're happy to do that. It keeps a lot of us employed. But the point is that trying to control everything except one factor didn't make sense, doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it is a complex system, isn't it? So that was a second factor. And by the way, those experiments also rely on what's called Gaussian statistics, the idea of the bell-shaped curve. But you know, there's no mean learner. There's no learner in the middle that is real. It's all just a statistical artifact. And so when we look at bell-shaped curves and think that I mean, sometimes it's important to generalize to a group level, but doing so, we overlook the individual. And even in our research on individual differences, which is wonderful research and it should continue, but even that research reports on groups. So we look at extroverts, so we look at willingness to communicate, people as a group, usually. And we make generalizations because that's what researchers do. But we lose sight of the individual and we assume the individual somewhere in there. But you know what? I think we have a lot to learn from the so-called outliers. Teachers know that each learner is individual. So that was a second thing that I found problematic in the research. The third, I'm just going to look down here, but I got to put my glasses on to do that. Oh yeah, well, it sort of said it before. It's the disregard for context, you know, and I don't mean context as just the institution or just the culture. I mean that the total panoply, the total immersion of the person in the context is really important. And I pointed out that just a moment ago when I talked about the individual nature of language acquisition. We can't ignore context. Context is so important. And in a complex system, one thing that makes it special is that it allows for an understanding of the factors that are part of the system, but also how they interact with what's outside the system. So that's a really important point, that context makes the difference. Yeah, so those are some of the things that so you're kind of primed for something to come along, I think, when you have these dissatisfactions, some of which I've contributed to, right? I've contributed some of that. But I guess I wasn't looking for something, but on one occasion, a book was placed in my hands by James Blake called Chaos, the Making of a New Science. I didn't read it right away, but when I did, on page 24, I saw the sentence, "In a nonlinear system, the act of playing the game has a way of changing the rules." And he wasn't talking about language rules. But I realized, yes, that's it. We need a more global view. We need a systems view. We need a view of an unbounded system. Plurilingualism is a nice example. You know, how do you put the boundaries around languages? We need a kind of view that allows for the emergence of novelty, not just conformity to uniformity. And all of these things came about, again, informed partly by the dynamics of my discontent and my resonating the dynamics of complex systems. It has opened up an ecological view that we have to look beyond the individual players to the ideologies in the context, to the history of the players, that is the teachers and learners in the system. And it's given me a new way to think. So for all those reasons, the complexity, the dynamism, the nonlinearity, the systems view, a system is not just a collection of things. It's a collection of things, yes, but they have some relationship to one another. So if you think about the moon and the earth, right? The earth has certain properties, tides that are affected by the moon. But the moon in itself is affected by the gravitational pull of the earth. So together they form a duo system, an earth-moon system. You might wonder if you're in the right webinar here, because I am getting away from language, but I hope it's not too much of a stretch for people to make the association with system, internal and external factors, multiple interconnected factors affecting one another. When something happens in this part of the system, it affects something else in this part of the system. The unboundedness, so that language itself can't be put in a box. It's open. Blake says it's becoming never, and he doesn't talk about language, but it becoming not being. Becoming not being. So I've used a complexity theory perspective, for example, to say we should talk about second language development, not second language acquisition, because acquisition suggests that you acquire it and then you have it. But that's not right. That's not true. I mean, we use language differently with different people. We use it on different occasions. We use it in the home, different from the workplace, maybe, although these days they're one and the same. But yeah, I think it has a new appreciation of language. I think there's a new appreciation of its learning. I call it development, not acquisition. There's no end point. The so-called target language is always changing. So I don't know, I could go on and on, I guess you can tell, but it has changed the way I think about language, its learning, and its teaching. And for that, I'm grateful. You know, I've been at this, I first talked about this in Montreal at a second language research conference in 1994. So what is that? I've been at it for, how many years is that? 20, 26? Quarter of a century I've been at it. And I find that, you know, the theory is rich enough that, as I said 2 years ago in an article, I'm always learning. I'm always learning.
What you were saying about the individual, I think it's really interesting. And the way that when you said that some people might think they're not in the right webinar, it's quite fascinating, because I think it's all about how we perceive what you say as well, and how we to some extent, there's the agency in that also.
Yes, yes, yes. So,
what could you tell us about the
Can I just talk about, can I just build on what you just said, the power of the individual? Think, Florencia, about second language, I call it development. Think about it. How many times our theories have been corrected, or at least challenged, because of individual case studies, because of individuals who have been studied for their individual success. So I'm thinking of Wes, for example, who was studied by Dick Schmidt. Wes was an art dealer in Hawaii. He was Japanese American. He was very successful. He had lots of interaction with English speakers and others living in Hawaii. But Wes's language never progressed. If you entertain a target language perspective, that is, his grammatical language never developed. And so then you look at that and you say, well, gosh, he had psychological proximity, he had social proximity, he had comprehensible input. Why not? Now, see, Wes is a great example of an individual who makes us stop and think, well, you know, what gives here? I mean, you could say, well, he's an outlier, but I'm intrigued by people like that. I want to know why they act the way they do. And we have a number of case studies who have that the value of them is challenging the status quo theories, right? We have Julie, in a British citizen who married an Egyptian man, went to live in Cairo, and is said to, at age 21, and is said to speak Egyptian Arabic. So she's basically doesn't have an accent, can pass as a Cairene, you know, but she's past the critical period. Now, how did she do that? You know, these are important to know. That's what I meant by we have a lot to learn from the outliers.
Right.
Agency. You want me to talk about agency?
You mentioned agency, yes.
Yes, because it made me think about that and how the interaction that you were also talking about.
Yeah. Well, I've become interested in agency. I just seized the opportunity, thank you, of late. And my interest in agency, well, it's not so surprising, you know. Laura Ahern, an anthropological linguist, noted that people, or scholars anyway, become interested in agency during tumultuous times. So you can see why agency has attracted a lot of interest of late. And I wrote about this in an article last year in the Modern Language Journal on learner agency. But you know what? I've been concerned about agency for a long time because I feel like our theories and our methods, to be quite honest, often deny the agency of learners. I mean, I myself, for example, was excited at the beginning of the 70s with the idea that there might be a built-in syllabus. That's what Porter told us. It was a built-in syllabus. And I got excited. I thought, wow, if we could teach in a way that we taught to the built-in syllabus in our students, we could be so much more effective, right? It would be so much more teaching in a harmonious way. But that doesn't allow for much agency. If there's a built-in syllabus, it suggests that you just open, you know, you just turn on the switch and the rest is taken care of. Not much agency there. Or if you think about methods, you know, repeat after me, there's not much agency in that kind of method. And even, you know, things like comprehensible input. I mean, the way at least it has been portrayed is the teacher is the provider of the comprehensible input. But why can't the student decide what's comprehensible and what's not comprehensible? Why can't the student find his? I mean, nobody wants to give incomprehensible input. Well, I don't know. Maybe you should challenge learning.
That's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
we
thinking
should contact Crescent about that.
John Fanslow's, you know, saying, take something and just flip it. So I said, maybe if you should give incomprehensible input. But in any case, the point is the teacher doesn't have to provide it, doesn't have to be the sole provider, right? So I think there's been a lot of de-agentifying, if I may do that, moves in our field. And the consequence of that is, unfortunately, that students, even by the best of intentioned researchers and teachers, I think students are positioned in a rather passive way. Now, that doesn't then equip them. I mean, everybody has agency, but if it isn't supported, if it isn't enabled, then students aren't going to be as effective in learning in the classroom, and they're not going to be able to go beyond, or not as well. I can't say they're not going to be able to, but being able to act in an agentive way, goodness knows we need it these days. We need it these days. Students taking agency, taking responsibility. Let me give a definition of it. The feeling, agency in language learning, the feeling of ownership of your learning process and control of your learning process, right? That's so important to make our students partners with us in learning. But also, as I said a moment ago, beyond the classroom, to make them effective, ethical citizens of the world, because we need that. We really need that these days. So agency, encouraging the agency, providing the enabling conditions as teachers that will encourage or promote the agency of our students seems really important to me. It's not, again, students have agency. Teachers need agency too, by the way. That's another story, of course. And often they don't feel agentive. They aren't given the opportunity to own what they do because there's too much imposed on them. But anyway, back to learners, we can, I think, create enabling conditions that support the agency of our students so that they are not only better off in the classroom, but they're better off in their lives. After all, they're going to have to reinvent themselves many times, we're told, in the future. And it's not only about livelihood, you know, it's not only about livelihood. It's about helping them to become, that sounds paternalistic. It's about encouraging empathy for others. That's what language learning is all about as well.
Wow.
I think.
So, yes, well, agency is, I mean, it's something that Sarah Mercer was talking with us a little bit about as well. And what's very interesting for us when you mention agency, and when she mentioned agency as well, is exactly that. And in fact, I think it was in one of your papers, Emancipation of the Learner, that you quoted somebody whose name I cannot remember, unfortunately, who said something along the lines of, there has been this idea that, I mean, you mentioned the expression target language, for example, that there is this idea in second language acquisition. Again, the term acquisition suggests, as I think you quoted in that paper, that the student is like a host for the language. And that's an idea that you're quite keen to, well, or a theory that you're quite keen to dispel, I understand.
Yes, I can't remember his name either.
It begins with a K.
And I wrote the article. I got to go back and read what I wrote and see what I think. But yeah, it's right there on the tip of my tongue. Somebody put it in the chat room, chat box. Maybe that'll help. But yes, that's right, Alastair. The whole idea that learners don't really own their learning or their language, right? They're always just borrowing it from somebody else. That denies agency, you know, that denies agency. Language use, learning and use, is a very creative process. And yet, often our learners are denied that creativity. You know, they coin a neologism and they're penalized for it because it's not a form that conforms to this target or standard language. So how can we emancipate our learners? That's right, that's the word I used.
Yes.
And in so doing, help them to become creative, unloosen the shackles, and let them use the language for what they want to use it for.
Right. I'm going to go back to complexity. Oh, actually, sorry.
There it is.
Yeah, somebody did it.
Brzezinski, who did that? Oh, great.
Steffi. That's one of our friends. Thank you very much, Steffi.
Thank you for the name.
Great. And so, beg your pardon, before Steffi put it in the box, actually, Professor Sarah Mercer herself has written it in the box.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Wow. Okay, so what I was going to ask you was about complexity theory. For example, I think it was in the same paper, and Sarah will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was in the same paper that you mentioned, for example, well, the US politician, correct me if I'm wrong, but Republican politician Sarah Palin using the word, yes, was it refudiate?
Refudiate. She combined repudiate with refuse, and she called it refudiate. And that word in 2010, I think it was, became the word of the year, refudiate. But of course, it isn't a word. but because it was uttered by a vice presidential candidate in the United States, it received great attention. Some would say notoriety. But I don't know if anybody ever corrected her. I mean, it became the word of the year, right? Because it was repeated so often. Maybe for the wrong intention it was repeated, but it was. But that's what I meant by, yes, the creativity. I mean, I coined the term grammaring, Grammaring. I coined that. Now, if a learner had said that, perhaps the learner would have been corrected, but I did it for a purpose. And I have, you know, because of my inheritance, I'm able to do that. I'm able to use English to create new words, and nobody bats an eye. I don't get a red mark on a paper. I don't get an editor to reject my paper because I use grammaring, ing on it, right? But I did it for a reason. So, but we do that all the time. I mean, we create language all the time. Yes, of course we use conventional forms. We have to. But we put them together in novel ways to express meaning and to reflect our identities, to position ourselves the way we wish to be positioned. And we do that. It's not a matter of, you know, having a bunch of rules and a bunch of words and putting them together to make meaning. It's a much more fluid process. And we plurilinguals, we borrow from other languages to put things together to make meaning the way we wish. So I'm going on and on. I think you may.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah.
That's what we're here for, Dr. Larsen-Freeman. It's that's all good.
I'm good at this. I'm good at this. Ask my students.
Because it's interesting because there was another word that you mentioned in the same article, and I think it was something like watchale or something like that. A combination of
watchale.
Watchale, watch and vidale. Yes, in Spanish.
Oh, very good. You've really done your homework, Alastair. I haven't remembered. That article was written a while ago, so I've got to remember. But watchale is, I think Walt Wolfram, the sociolinguist at North Carolina State University, brought that one to our attention. Watchale is a combination of English, watch, and mirale, right, the Spanish look or watch. And so one of just people living in North Carolina, where there was a large Spanish-speaking population, not one of them, I mean, it became the term, watchale. Here's a nice example, thank you for that, of where you use your resources from two different languages to create a new form. That's right. Do this all the time.
It really reminds me of a poem by Grace Nichols, the Afro-Caribbean writer, who talks about I have traveled the ocean, I have lost my tongue, from the root of the old one, a new one has sprung. And I like the idea of, in fact, someone's put plurilingualing in the box, and I think in your article it mentions, somebody mentions translingualing or translanguaging or something like that. What I was going to ask is this though, if, for example, okay, a vice presidential candidate like Sarah Palin can make a word like that and it can be used. However, if one of our students says refudiating, or they write refudiating in a paper, do we as teachers not then correct it, if you see what I mean? Because I love the idea of the word refudiating. It's a great word and it makes perfect sense, that sort of, you know, portmanteau. But as English language teachers, if we saw it on a paper, we'd probably say, what would we say? No, this is wrong, and put a line through it or something. My question, I suppose, is, I'm going to totally play devil's advocate here, but is there not an argument for saying, okay, because I love the idea of complex dynamic systems theory, but don't we as language teachers have a job to provide correct models of language? I told you, devil's advocate, and again, correct our students. What would you say to that?
Yeah, well, it's a sociopolitical thing, right? It's not a linguistic thing. Saying repudiate is not, I mean, there's no linguistic reason why that can't be a word. It's just a sociopolitical construct that keeps it from being one. But do we as teachers have responsibility for teaching standard language, I guess, or teaching the language our students are there to learn? And by all means, we do. And let me just back up a little bit. In a complex system, I talked about emergence, how through interaction forms emerge, and the system gets built up through those interactions. But there is a corresponding force that once the patterns are, I don't want to say established, but are being formed, they in turn constrain what is emerging. So there is a reciprocal dynamism or reciprocal action there. It's called reciprocal causality. There's an emergence, and then there's a kind of top-down entrainment. So it's not that the system can just spiral out of control, right? We have to have mutual intelligibility. We have to have a common core. Now, getting back to the teacher's role in this, I would say that, yeah, I mean, if the students are there to learn standard English that they can use in an academic setting, then I think we can and probably should call attention to a form that doesn't conform to that dialect. However, I think it's important to recognize language is used by people for different purposes at different times. And so the way I would handle it is I wouldn't say that's wrong. I would say, you know, that's interesting. I can see why you did that. That's fine if you want to use that word. But if you want to write an academic paper, then you probably should use repudiate or refuse. I mean, whatever the meaning is that the student, try to find out what the meaning is that the student was trying to convey, and help them find a way to do so in a way that would be acceptable. There are conventions in language. There has to be, there have to be. See, I can't even do this. There have to be conventions because otherwise we'd have mutual unintelligibility. But that doesn't mean that they have to be penalized for it. We have to help understand what they're trying to say and find a way to say that and explain that they're not necessarily wrong, but but they're going to face the consequences. Let them choose whether they want to use it or not. But they have to understand the consequences of the choice.
Because one of the things that you mention in, I think it might even be the same paper, is the... Did
you read anything else, Alastair?
I did, I promise. And I read about, and I was going to say, I read about complex dynamic systems theory, and I can't even pronounce it. But you mentioned the idea of liminal areas, liminality, and how it is that in regions where, for example, whether there's any kind of, I'm going to say border to be crossed, or learners getting to a certain stage, as it were, then it's the area of most abundance and most creativity. So I like what you're saying about, yeah, because there is going to be an idealized standard that students in a way sort of want to be judged by, but at the same time, yeah, we shouldn't deny the creativity. I mean, actually, someone's just put in the chat box, Mariam Ryan. Now, I'm going to offer this up to you, Dr. Larsen-Freeman. Coining new words is the privilege of native speakers. Discuss.
Yeah, well, that's what I was trying to say when I said it's the socio-political thing, right? Yeah. Not a linguistic thing. So, yeah, that was my point about I had privilege to be able to do that. And not everybody does. Well, everybody does it. The question is, if you're a student and you have a teacher who doesn't want you to produce forms that don't conform to the standard language, then you may be in trouble. But yes, I think it is a privilege of a speaker, not necessarily a native speaker. Oh, maybe that's the trick. No, not necessarily of a native speaker. No, not at all. I mean, I think certainly proficient speakers of the language do it all the time. Not necessarily. The liminal area is interesting. You know, in complexity theory, they talk about the edge of chaos. It's that place of order, disorder, where there's the most creativity unleashed. And that to me is the liminal space. Who was it? Sapir, I think, who said you could cross Europe on foot and never really cross a language boundary, you know, because right at the border between France and Germany, for example, it isn't like you take a step and you're speaking French or they are speaking French or a step and they're speaking German. It's that in-between place. And that is a place, that in-between place is a place of great creativity.
I love that.
But since you mentioned that you'd coined the term grammaring, could you expand on that a little bit? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you, Florencia. So So I coined it for the same, it was informed by the same theory. I told you it's been a rich theory for me. One of the things I was unhappy with in teaching for a long time, my own teaching, is that students would seem to have learned something at one particular time in my class, and then when they returned, it wasn't there. And I came across Alfred North Whitehead's term, 1924. He called it the inert knowledge problem. He wasn't talking about language again, but he was talking about that phenomenon that students seem to be able to do something at one time and then they can't at another time. And when it came to grammar, that seemed to me to be a real problem. And I observed this around the world. It wasn't just in my own teaching, right? Students do the rules and they'd be able to use them and they could produce an accurate whatever, the target of the day. But then they go out the classroom and you'd hear them not be able to do that or not the next day. It was called the inert knowledge problem. And of course, inert means what? Inactive, dormant. And so inspired by complex dynamic systems theory, CDST, I got it right, Alastair? Complex.
Don't ask me.
I said, aha, maybe if we taught language in a more dynamic way, we could help overcome the inert knowledge problem, right? And so I coined the term grammaring to get at that, a more dynamic process. But you know, there were 4 or 5 reasons I coined the term grammaring. One of them was to convey the dynamic process of language, of using grammar, of using it. Another one was by analogy with skills, because you have 4 skills, right? Speaking, listening, reading, writing. Why not grammaring? You know, if you convey it as a skill, if you think of it as a skill, it might be much more effective when students might be much more readily able to use it with the practice that a skill requires. Another reason why I coined the term grammaring was to get at what I was just talking about a moment ago, which is that we can take pieces of language, if you want, we can take elements in language and we can recombine them, we can create new forms. And I wanted to sort of have that as a reflexive example of that very process. So grammaring to me, and then of course, along with that is my model of grammar as a 3-part system of form or structure, meaning or semantics, and pragmatics or use or pragmatics. And I usually show that in a pie chart and show that they're interconnected with bidirectional arrows. Those 3 wedges form meaning and use. And I, you know, for a while there, it was perilous to talk about grammar. I never stopped talking about it, but I took some heat for it because grammar was considered boring and dull and, you know, why would you teach it and why would you have your students work on it and all of that. But to me, that just in the same way that I think a method is misunderstood, the concept of method, I think that grammar is misunderstood. I really do. I think that if you think of grammar as brittle bones, you know, just structures out there without any connection to meaning, well, of course, yes. But if you think of grammar as I do, in a much more organic way, and a way that is not only about the structure or the bones, but is about the meat, about the flesh and the blood too. That is about how we make meaning as humans. We need grammar for that. And how we use language in a context, excuse me, that's appropriate to the context, but also to how we want to present ourselves in that context. Grammar allows us to do that. I've talked about the grammar of choice because it's not enough. It's not a linguistic straitjacket. Grammar is not a linguistic straitjacket. It is a powerful resource for making meaning in an appropriate way. Now, there are probably people there whose hackles are rising as I say that, but I will defend that position. I think grammar is indispensable and it's wrong to overlook it. That doesn't mean that you teach it in a decontextualized, linear sequence. That's not what I'm saying. Oh. But grammaring is very important. Being able to see, There's the ing, being able to use the structures, or the constructions is probably a better word, accurately, meaningfully, and appropriately is really important. And that's what I was trying to convey with grammaring. Doing it, seeing it as much more of a dynamic system. Florencia, I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. And I love that you mentioned the fact of the choice, because that takes me back to that agency and
Yes.
the learner interacting with the language as well, which leads me to the next question about affordances as well, and the resources available and how the learner interacts with them. Could you tell us a little bit about affordances as well?
Yes, I talked about this in an IATEFL plenary in the 50th anniversary in Birmingham, or I guess you call it Birmingham, don't you?
Birmingham, yep.
So I made a distinction between two types of affordance. I call them first order and second order. And I'm not crazy about binaries, but I'd heard affordance being used to talk about what was in the environment, right? So the teacher afforded things for his or her students. But that's not the way it was used in ecological psychology. It wasn't the way it was used when it was first talked about by the Gibsons, J.J. and Eleanor Gibson. The idea of second order, so first order affordances is what's in the environment, what's available there in the environment. But the key to affordances, at least as I understand them, is not that. It's about the learner's perception of learning opportunities in the environment. So you can have a rich environment, a rich language environment, an immersion experience. But if the learner doesn't perceive something in that environment as potentially valuable, that is providing action for the learner, learning for the learner, it's not going to happen. And I've come to believe, and I can say this, I'm old enough now, that really I think teaching is all about managing the affordances, helping your students, and this is another concept from complexity theory, it's a relational theory, helping your students create a relationship with the language. I don't, you say language, it's so general, but with some aspect of the language in a way that they can relate and find relevance and see its potential to their own lives. And to me, that's the beauty of an affordance. It's not just there in the environment, but it's helping learners to take advantage of what's there in the environment, helping them to create a relationship with what's there in the environment. That's critical. Tom's wrote an article that was published in 2014 in the Modern Language Journal, and he was talking about I think it was a man. He was talking, his name's Tom's, T-H-O-M, so I always think of it as a man. But anyway, he was talking about a class where the student made a mistake in a class on Spanish culture, made a linguistic error. And rather than recasting it, which a lot of teachers do, and there's nothing wrong with it, reformulating it in a correct way, he took that and he embroidered it in a way that other students understood the issue, right? It wasn't a private conversation. It wasn't monologic or dialogic conversation. It was a multilogic conversation, multilog conversation, where other students understood it and could benefit from that. He helped to create a relationship between what the first student said and what was available to be learned, not only by that student, but by the others. I don't know if that makes sense, but to me, affordance is a powerful idea. It's not, teaching doesn't cause learning, we know that. But how can you create opportunities for learning to take place so that the student perceives them and can then act on them? To me, that's very powerful.
Yeah. At the moment, because here in Argentina, for example, we're still under quarantine right now, and those of us who are lucky enough, let's say, to either teach by Zoom or have students who can use a platform like this to teach and be taught in. I wonder sometimes if, for example, with the concept of agency, if it's one of the first things it's important to do is get the students focused, first of all, because I wonder if one of the worries I have with the concept of agency is it kind of presupposes an engagement by the learner as well. For me, like learners of a certain age who want to engage, and I don't know whether for
Why is
younger
that a problem? Why is that a problem for you, Alastair?
Why is it a problem for me? I think because for what I don't know is whether younger learners have the same kind of interest, as it were, if you see what I mean, as to engage as learners who are slightly older do. You see what I mean?
I see. Well, I can think it could work the other way too. I mean, you know, we can think of adolescents who don't want to be there, right? Or I shouldn't say adolescents, but older learners who don't want to be there. You have to show them that you have something to teach them that's valuable, that they can learn. I taught a grammar course at the University of Michigan for undergraduates, mostly graduate students, EAP course, grammar called Grammar for Reading, for Speaking and Writing. Well, the students didn't want to be there. They didn't want to be in a grammar course. They studied grammar for a long, long time, right? And furthermore, to make it worse, they had to take a placement exam, and because they had done poorly on the structure part of the placement exam, they were counseled into my course. Well, can you imagine teaching a class there when no one wanted to be there? They had failed into my course. So the only way I knew that I could succeed is I had to help them understand, or I had to help them see something I believe, which is that I could help them with their grammar. I had something to teach them that they didn't, even though they knew all the rules, wouldn't help them. For example, they didn't know when to use the present perfect in the past. They didn't know when to use active and passive. They didn't know how to not plagiarize. They were always being accused of plagiarizing, but to provide, to get somebody else's ideas and to use them in a new way, I mean, that is with a new form, is a very, very high level skill. They didn't know how to do that. I had to show them that I had something that they could learn, so that's what I do with my graduate students. For kids, I think they're naturally curious. You just have to help them. They have to contribute content that they are interested in, right? They have to create their own content, and not only the what, but the how. And that's the agentive part of it, right? Help students. I think kids are maybe more naturally agentive, but it's later on when we're not given permission to enact it, it becomes a problem. But you do have to hook them. You have to find a way to help them see, not that they're learning something that's going to be helpful to them 20 years from now, but that they can learn because they're interested in what's available. And by the way, the agency thing comes up a lot these days because, you know, we're in the 4.0 web iteration now, and goodness knows, a lot of agency is being practiced by students who join affinity groups, right? Groups where people have common interests and they can exchange posts, or even things like e-twinning, the electronic version of pen pals. I mean, there are a lot of ways that students now, just through their searches and through their game playing, their video game playing, enact their agency. So I don't think it has to be something that's going to be difficult to overcome. I think just it's a matter of finding something that interests them.
Yes, absolutely. And it makes me think that there's a student I had at the secondary school that I teach at who learnt a huge amount of English over the summer because she was playing Fortnite, that online game, and she really didn't like it. She wasn't particularly interested in learning the language, and then suddenly over the summer saw her brother playing Fortnite and then started chatting to people from all over the world. And came back
that's what I meant by the hook, right?
Yeah, she came back with like a B2 level English after the summer.
This is also taking me back to what we were saying about the individual as well. The importance of the teacher understanding each student as an individual and considering that when also, we're back to the first question when we were talking about methods, like choosing which method to use depending on your individuals.
Yes, that's right.
it's been particularly difficult now during this time teaching digitally, and a lot of teachers are still in that situation. Now, which advice would you have for teachers who are still teaching in these circumstances?
You mean online? What advice I would give them?
Yes.
Online?
Yes, or online, or in
the situation we're
in our
going
pandemic
right
that
now.
we're still going through.
Yeah,
yes.
well, I'm no expert on online language teaching, so let me say that right up front. I think it's tough, and I do think one of the silver linings, it's just a very dim silver maybe, but there's an appreciation for teachers in my country in the way there never has been before, because parents have been stuck, if I may use that word, at home trying to supervise their own students or teach their own students, their own children, and they're finding out how difficult it can be. So I wouldn't say that I'm a expert. I would say that we have to be careful that administrators and budget managers don't see online learning as an alternative to face-to-face. I don't think it ever will be. I mean, I think the interaction and the interpersonal relationships are so important and very difficult to establish in an online medium. And I may be proven wrong on that, but there's a lot of advantage to being online, but there's still something so human about the connection in a face-to-face way that I find it difficult to imagine. So I'm not an expert on teaching online. I'm in admiration for the resilience and creativity and industry of teachers who've had to learn this, and in some cases overnight to do this. What I would say, and I'm not in the business of giving out advice, but what I would say is that it's really important to take care of yourselves, not only because of the pandemic, but just because of the demands that are there. If you can do anything about it, trying to find an opportunity for a position that gives you agency, that you find school leaders who support you as being really important. And then maybe finally, it seems to me we need more than ever the compassion, the empathy, the sense of togetherness that language teachers bring. And we have problems around this world: racial injustice, global warming, climate change, not to mention the pandemic. And we're going to need that compassion. We're going to need that creativity. We're going to need the sense of togetherness if we're going to come out, not to the same old, but to a new normal where justice and health and sustainability are all possible. Not only possible, but present. And to me, language teachers have a big role to play in that. And I hate to give us one more thing to do, but I would say, take care and thank you. You are, it's not only the incredible efforts of the frontline healthcare workers or the food people, the food deliverers, it's also the educators that need to be appreciated, welcomed, and supported in these days.
I'm slightly lost for words by what you've just said. I think
was lost for words too. In case you noticed, I always like to talk in threes, and I lost the third one.
No, I honestly thought that was very, very beautiful. What you just said. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, I deeply regretfully say that we're past our time, which is awful. In fact, so many people, Dr. Larsen-Freeman, have been putting in the chat box, please can she come back again, because we want to hear from her.
Ask Sarah.
So, ask Sarah, yeah. That's what we should call it, ask Sarah. Thank you. I don't quite know what to say. It's been quite an emotional experience for me having you
so much.
Yes, having you here today.
Thank you.
And obviously, thank you very, very much to International House Montevideo for providing the Zoom room and for sponsoring. We're all in this together.
And everyone for coming to the meeting.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And we will be putting the recording up soon in the We're All in This Together folder once it's processed. Dr. Diane Larsen-Freeman, thank you.
Thank you for your inspiration and for making this happen, Alastair, and Florencia, for all of you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to
keep up the good work.
Florencia's just put it on full screen so everyone can, well, you should be able to see everyone's pretty little faces there. So a round of applause for Dr. Larsen-Freeman. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Such an honor.
Yes, an absolute honor. Well, Dr. Larsen-Freeman, thank you very much. We'd definitely love to have you back again at some point in the near future. So we'll be pestering yourself and Professor Sarah Mercer about that soon. Rest assured.
Thank you for making it happen.
Thank you. Thank you for making it happen. Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
See you next time.
Yes. Bye.